Hello, we're at Bristol for the last game of this Women's Ashes series. Um, England lost the second T20 again at Hove, possibly slightly less unconvincingly. Sid, what did you make of what we saw at Hove the other day?
Oh dear, I felt that there was a sort of sad inevitability about it, unfortunately. Heather Knight said afterwards, if only we'd got 20 or 30 more runs, we would have been in it. But it just really felt like that if they got 20 or 30 more runs, the Australians would too. England did pick up three early wickets, but then Meg Lanning and Elise Perry came together and they looked totally in control, and they looked like, if they'd needed to score at 8 and over, they'd have scored at 8 and over. If they needed to score at 10, they'd have scored at 10. I don't think England were ever in that game. They changed their tactics slightly. They opted to bat and try and put a score on the board. They also didn't want what had happened to Chelmsford happening all over again there. But they were never going to be able to post enough runs. It felt like Australia would always be able to go one better.
Okay. Obviously, last match of the series today, as I said. Is there a certain feeling that actually, to some extent, England will be happy that this series is drawing to a close finally?
I think they'll be very relieved. Yeah. We're not inside the camp, obviously, but the impression that we get from the outside is that they're not really having a great time at the moment. England have had a really horrible wake up call. They've been in bed, they've been happily snoring and dreaming blissfully of victories over Sri Lanka and the West Indies, of beating India at home in that T20 series, and then suddenly the alarm's gone off at 4:30 in the morning in their ears, beep, 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 and Australia have come along and they've given England a shock. England really genuinely believed that they were going to be able to compete in this series, and unfortunately they haven't been.
Yeah, I thought that something Claire Connor said in her interview on Sky the other day, which is well worth a watch if you haven't yet. I believe it's online as a standalone video. Was actually really interesting, in that she said that for a few of the younger players in the England team, they've never experienced a series loss. And actually, if you go back a couple of years, that's probably true. That this is something that's very unfamiliar to them. To somebody like Sophie Ecclestone, it's all been very upbeat and positive and happy, and now suddenly they're having to deal with something. That's actually probably the hardest thing to deal with in international sport, is losing, because you work so hard at it. And it'll be interesting to see kind of going forward how players like that kind of possibly mature and develop perhaps as a result of that. So is there a bit of a kind of a positive angle, struggling to find one, but let's try on this series? We're also reflecting on the car on the way here, weren't we? Kind of thinking about the fact that 4 years ago England also lost the Ashes at home in quite a difficult fashion, and they lost the Test, and ultimately people were calling for Charlotte Edwards' head, and it was probably the beginning of the end for her, and it was certainly the end of things for the head coach then, Paul Shaw. Does this, how does this compare with 2015? I guess, is this worse?
I think, to me, in some ways, it feels a bit worse. From a points perspective, even if England can pull something out of the bag today, it feels worse. It feels like the gap is bigger. What do you think about that, Raf?
Yeah, it's in a kind of quantifiable fashion. It will be a worse series defeat. I suppose the thing to say is that I feel like England, while they are receiving criticism this time around, 4 years ago it felt like a lot of the criticism was from people who were coming in from a very casual perspective and criticising Charlotte Edwards having watched barely any women's cricket, this time around it feels like we've got people in the press box who actually have covered a lot more women's cricket, know what they're talking about, and therefore the narrative is now that, which I think is right, it's not a false narrative, that the problems are structural rather than with kind of personnel necessarily. So I think that in terms of the feeling, it's possibly more that it was a bit inevitable rather than that England have been really terrible.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also understand one of the differences in 2015 was that 2015 it felt like England had played badly, whereas actually, in truth, this time I think that Australia have made England look bad. But really, what's going on in this summer is that Australia are really, really good. Heather Knight keeps saying this thing, we haven't become a bad team overnight. They haven't. That's absolutely true and fair. What's happened is that, not quite overnight, but over the last 2 years, since England last competed in the Ashes in Australia in 2017, Australia have just taken it up another level, and England just aren't able to compete at that level.
Okay. Well, obviously we've still got one last T20 match in the series ahead of us. How do you think that England should approach today, Sid?
Well, it's the same problems come up as we talked in our video last time. That do you bring in new players in the knowledge that they might get smacked all over the place and it might damage them psychologically, or do you protect them and give the roles to the older players, the Laura Marshes who have been there and seen it all before and won't be affected in the same way. I'd really like to see Maddie Villiers today. I think she's been called up to the squad. Let's bring her in. Let's give her a game. As far as we know, the squad is exactly the same. We haven't seen any squad news. There's been nothing official. So we're not expecting anybody that wasn't in that squad to suddenly walk out onto the pitch today.
I can tell you that Bryony Smith was there at the Jeanette Britton opening last night, so she hasn't been with the England squad. She certainly wasn't at the England squad yesterday. She was at the Oval in London. So that's one player who we won't be seeing here today. But I totally agree with you. I think play Maddie Villiers. What have you got to lose? The series is gone. The T20 mini series is gone, and we really need to now be looking to pull things back ahead of the T20 World Cup in February, because otherwise England are going to be going into that thoroughly demoralised and just thinking, well, we're not going to be able to compete really.
Yeah. Let's see what they do today. England, if they can pull a win out today, that will take a little bit back from the series. It will Australia are certainly talking that they want to get this this unbeaten series. If England can prevent them getting that unbeaten series today, that will be a little victory amid what's been a very difficult second half of the summer for England.
I think either way there's going to be some sore heads tomorrow in the Australian camp, because they do seem to be planning their big night out in Bristol to celebrate. So well done Australia, congratulations, you have played brilliantly, even though it's saying that between gritted teeth slightly. But we'll be bringing you all the action from Bristol.